All rise, veuillez vous lever. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience de la Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Good morning, everyone. Court officer, please call the case.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. Situation in the Central African Republic 2 in the case of the prosecutor versus Alfred Yekatom and Patrice Ngaissona, case reference ICC 0114-0118, and for the record, we are in open session.
Thank you very much. I ask for the appearance of the parties. If there is no change, that will suffice. And if there is a change, perhaps the change would suffice.
Yes, Mr. President, I get the point. Just to say good morning to you, there is no change, and good morning, everyone.
Thank you very much. Ms. Masida.
Morning, Mr. President. Same composition except for Ms. Evelyn Ombeni, who is not in attendance this morning.
Thank you. Mr. Sepoun.
Good morning, Your Honors. No changes on my side.
Ms. Dimitri.
Good morning, Your Honors. Mr. Yekatom is present in the courtroom, and there is no change on the Yekatom bench.
Thank you. And Mr. Knopf, finally.
Very good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. Good morning, everyone in the courtroom. We have two changes. Mr. Matthias Goffet and Ms. Lena Gidou are in the courtroom, except for Mr. Desdavi and Ms. Crillon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Knopf. We continue with the closing arguments by the prosecution. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors, and everyone in the courtroom. I'll be presenting on the charges related to the Yamwara school base, specifically counts 11 to 17. The evidence proves beyond reasonable doubt that in the aftermath of the 5th December 2013 Bangui attack, Yekatom and his anti-Balaka group committed multiple heinous crimes at the Yamwara school base. These include war crimes of murder, cruel treatment, and torture, as well as crimes against humanity, specifically murder, torture, imprisonment, persecution, and other inhumane acts. The evidence shows that Yekatom established the Yamwara school base in Boeing after the 5th December 2013 attack on Bangui. Yekatom's group consisted of anywhere from approximately 1,000 individuals to thousands, including FACA members. At the apex of this massive force stood Yekatom himself, a leader who commanded his group with full control. The defense argues at paragraph 423 of its final brief that Yekatom, quote, infrequently visited the Yamwara school base and that such visits were brief, often lasting only a few minutes, end quote. But the evidence tells a different story. Insider P1786, an anti-Balaka member who was based at the Yamwara school, testified that Yekatom's anti-Balaka group was organized into military units, each led by FACA members. P1647, who was billeted at the base, testified that the entire force gathered regularly, once a week, in the Yamwara school grounds, in the presence of Yekatom and his subordinates. Yekatom's command was led by his deputies, Freddy Wanjo, Bena, and other commanders who oversaw the companies and sections. The evidence directly contradicts the defense's claim at paragraph 423 of its final brief that Wanjo, quote, undertook independent tasks in relation to his distinct unit. It demonstrates that Yekatom exercised authority not only over Wanjo, but also over the com zones he appointed in areas under his control. For example, Peace 1786 testified that, quote, Yekatom was the topmost commander, end quote. Yekatom issued orders and instructions directly to his elements or through his deputies and commanders. It was a deliberately structured hierarchy designed to implement Yekatom's will. Every decision and every directive flowed from the top, Yekatom himself. The Yamwara school base also served as a training ground for new anti-Balaka recruits. Through his commanders, Yekatom organized military training for his new recruits. Your Honors have heard from Peace 1786, who testified that civilians who joined Yekatom's group underwent military training to instill what was referred to as military spirit. These recruits were trained by section chiefs following Yekatom's instructions, demonstrating his intimate involvement in the preparation of his forces. Your Honors, the video evidence you have seen leaves no doubt about Yekatom's authority over his anti-Balaka forces at the Yamwara school base. This brief excerpt in French, which I will now play, depicts young recruits undergoing training and exercises at the Yamwara school base. In this excerpt, Yekatom himself appears, explaining how his group acquired weapons by attacking Seleka forces and seizing their arms. This admission highlights not only his leadership, but his active engagement in arming and preparing his forces. For the interpreters, the transcript is at CAR OTP 2118-4772 at 4774, lines 41 to 54. Please let us know when you're ready.
Dans cette école abandonnée, les jeunes combattants apprennent un semblant de discipline militaire, les méthodes de combat et l'entraînement physique. Souvent présentés comme une coalition pauvrement armée, ils nous expliquent comment ils récupèrent leur arsenal.
Dès qu'on peut connaître que les policiers sont ici dans leur poste, on étudie, puis on attaque et puis on prend l'arme.
Les anti-Balaka se disent prêts à se désarmer si les troupes françaises le leur demandent, à une seule condition, que la France exige le départ immédiat du président Jotodia.
I will play another short excerpt of an interview of Yekatom at the Yamwara school base. In this recording, Yekatom declares that he does not recognize Jotodia as president and explicitly states his readiness to attack Bangui. For the interpreters, the translation is at CAR OTP 2130-1307.
These are really, really poor villagers whose villages were attacked and they fought their way to the capital. One guy told us he fought 200 kilometers to get here, and they're not ready to leave until the president is out of office. The first fighter who could give us any answers about where the anti-Balaka stood was Commander Rambo. Surprisingly, he wasn't named after the movie character.
Bon, nous on ne peut pas à certaines dossiers. S'il s'agit de certaines dossiers, on ne peut pas venir en ces conditions. Nous, nos problèmes, c'est pour que nous déjà part avec ces mercenaires, c'est fini. On ne peut pas accepter de dossiers. Jusqu'à présent, moi-même, je connais que Dossier n'est pas président. Parce que depuis qu'il était venu, il y a les tueries, on peut tuer des gens par là, par-ci. Je ne peux pas accepter une Dojoja comme président.
What do you think will happen in the future? Are you planning to attack soon?
Non, mais nous, on demande pour qu'il démissionne. S'il ne veut pas démissionner, on doit attaquer. On est prêt. On n'est pas dans une province, on n'est pas loin des Bangui. Là, on est prêt. On avait fait comment de venir ici. S'il ne veut pas quitter, il va quitter par la force.
The testimony of P 1647 provides further evidence of Yekatom's command at the Yamwara school base. P 1647 described Yekatom as being in charge of discipline. Yekatom actively enforced strict control over his elements, personally intervening to punish commanders who defied his orders. He explained that when elements of Yekatom's group established unauthorized checkpoints in newly captured areas, Yekatom took swift and decisive action to identify those responsible and personally punish the commanders. This demonstrates Yekatom's leadership and his ability to enforce his authority at every level of his operation. The evidence establishes that the anti-Balaka activities at the Yamwara school base were not limited to military organization and training. Yekatom and his commanders orchestrated campaigns of violence, including the targeting and killing of Muslims. The goal was to eliminate the presence of Muslims in the areas under Yekatom's control, including the vicinity of the Yamwara school base. Your Honors, the evidence presented in the courtroom has been credible and compelling. You have heard from numerous witnesses, including insiders, detailing how, in late December 2013, Yekatom's group deliberately targeted 7 unarmed individuals at a roadblock. These individuals were singled out solely because of their association with Muslims and their perceived collective support for the Seleka. Among the victims were 3 Muslim women, innocent civilians who posed no threat. Their targeting was not only unjustified, but was rooted in discrimination and persecution, driven by the anti-Balaka's criminal policy of targeting Muslims. Yekatom's subordinates, including his chief of the 1st Division, Alcanto, forcibly abducted these 7 detainees and brought them to the Yamwara school base. From the very outset, their fate was marked by terror and violence. These detainees were defenseless, in the complete custody and control of Yekatom's men. Yet instead of protecting them, Yekatom's group escalated their suffering. At the base, the abductees were immediately threatened with death and taunted as traitors. Your Honors have heard from P 1705, who testified that Yekatom's section chief, Bourgeois, ordered the captives to undress and threatened them. They were not just prisoners. They were victims of targeted violence and humiliation. 3 of the male abductees endured repeated beatings with wooden clubs. They were forced to kneel, stripped of their dignity, and assaulted relentlessly. Their heads, arms, backs, and legs targeted without mercy. All of this occurred while they were interrogated about their ethnicity and baselessly accused of being Seleka sympathizers. The worst was reserved for the 4th male abductee, Sasie Lapo Goma. When Yekatom's elements discovered his FACA military card, he was singled out for treatment that P-1704 described as much worse than what the other abductees endured. Saint-Cyr was bound in the agonizing abattoir position, beaten with vehicle brake cables and clubs, and mutilated. His ears, toes, and fingers were cut off. The evidence is unequivocal. No relative, friend, or acquaintance of Saint-Cyr ever saw him alive again. His abduction, brutal beating, and torture culminated in his murder. Significantly, the evidence further reveals that Yekatom himself admitted to this crime in a conversation with a fellow Comzone. This admission underscores Yekatom's direct knowledge and involvement in Saint-Cyr Lapo's fate, leaving no doubt about his role in this heinous act. The defense alleges that Saint-Cyr Lapo was a Seleka member. Even if such a claim was true, it is legally irrelevant. At the time of his murder, Saint-Cyr Lapo was Odi Komba. He was in the custody of the anti-Balaka and defenseless. The law is unequivocal. Individuals who are unarmed and in custody are protected from harm, regardless of their past actions. The evidence shows that Saint-Cyr Lapo was murdered not for any immediate threat he posed, but because of his perceived political affiliation. His killing was an act of deliberate targeting based on identity. This was not an act of self-defense. This was persecution, plain and simple. Saint-Cyr's murder was not an isolated incident. It occurred within the broader context of a campaign of violence orchestrated by Yekatom, aimed at persecuting and eliminating perceived enemies. The female abductees were subjected to a different form of humiliation and degradation. They were forcibly stripped of their veils, separated from the men, and ordered to strip down to their underwear. They were frisked, threatened with weapons, and taunted by Yekatom's elements. The defense argues at paragraph 646 of its final brief that there were legitimate reasons to apprehend and temporarily detain the victims, citing suspicions that they were Seleka forces or spies. First, the defense's claim is speculative. There is no evidence to suggest that the 7 abductees were engaging or had engaged in hostilities at the time of their abduction or during their detention at the Yamwara school base. On the contrary, the evidence demonstrates that they were targeted and subjected to arrest, detention, and torture solely because of their association with Muslims and their perceived collective support for the Seleka. Second, regardless of whether their temporary detention was permitted, as suggested by the defense, international humanitarian law does not permit mistreatment, torture, and murder in detention. No justification, speculative or otherwise, can override the fundamental protections afforded to individuals in custody. The defense claims at paragraph 637 of its final brief that the mistreatment endured by the surviving abductees does not meet the gravity threshold, but the evidence proves otherwise. These individuals were defenseless captives at the mercy of Yekatom and his group. They posed no threat, nor could they resist the violence inflicted upon them. Instead of protecting them, Yekatom's group actively sought to deepen their suffering. The physical and psychological torment these captives endured was not incidental. It was deliberate. Yekatom's subordinates tortured Saint-Cyr not as a random act of violence, but as a calculated tactic. Their actions were designed to magnify the suffering of the surviving abductees, forcing them to witness their friend and family member endure these horrors. This was a deliberate strategy by Yekatom's subordinates to break the spirits of these captives, amplifying their physical and psychological pain. The 5 surviving abductees were eventually transferred to another anti-Balaka leader, Sylvester Yaguzu, before their release was secured through the intervention of the Sangaris forces and Samba Panza on or around 27 December 2013. Notably, Yekatom himself visited the abductees prior to their release, underscoring his continued involvement in their detention and control over their fate. While the defense concedes at paragraph 463 of its final brief that Yekatom contacted the Sangaris forces and, quote, made genuine efforts to secure their freedom, end quote, it contests his liability for the charged crimes. However, the evidence presented proves otherwise. First, the actions of Yekatom's subordinates were not isolated or random acts of violence. On the contrary, these crimes were intentional, premeditated, and carried out in line with Yekatom's standing instructions. His anti-Balaka elements detained, abducted, and tortured the victims and murdered Saint-Cyr Lapo because they were Muslims or perceived to be complicit with or supportive of the Seleka. These acts were driven by discriminatory intent in implementation of the anti-Balaka's common purpose and criminal organizational policy. The deliberate targeting of individuals based on religion and or perceived political affiliation underscores the calculated and systemic nature of these crimes. Second, the charged crimes occurred at the Yamwara school base, a location under Yekatom's control. His leadership and command structure extended across every facet of the base's operations, and the atrocities committed there were directly within his sphere of authority. Given Yekatom's control over the Yamwara school base and his leadership style, he was aware that crimes of this nature would occur in the ordinary course of events, in particular, since they fell within the common plan and criminal policy pursued by the anti-Balaka. Third, the evidence confirms that Yekatom was present and had direct knowledge of the crimes as they were being committed. This includes the torture and the later killing of Saint-Cyr Lapo, as well as the inhumane and cruel treatment inflicted on the surviving abductees. Fourth, Yekatom did not merely allow these crimes to occur. He actively endorsed them. He expressed his approval of his subordinates' participation in their commission and failed to punish or sanction any of the known perpetrators. His inaction and approval clearly signal his complicity. Finally, Yekatom, as the leader of his anti-Balaka group, held the ultimate authority over the fate of the abductees. their captivity and eventual release were entirely within his power. This level of control underscores his responsibility for the crimes committed while they remained under his authority. Your Honors, Yekatom's liability for these crimes is indisputable. The evidence shows that he exercised total control over the Yamwara school base, directed the discriminatory and violent actions of his subordinates, and held ultimate authority over the abductees' lives. The testimony of numerous witnesses, including insiders, the video evidence, and Yekatom's own words make this undeniable. This concludes the portion of the presentation on the Yamwara school incident. I'll now turn the presentation over to my colleague, Ms. Berdenikova.
Thank you, Ms. Patraban.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors, and good morning, everyone who's present today. Now, I will continue the prosecution's closing arguments, and I will cover counts 24 to 28 on the crimes committed along the PK9 Mbaiki axis in the Lobaye prefecture, and count 29 on the enlistment and use of children by Yekatom's group. Your Honors, the crimes that Yekatom and Ngaissona bear criminal responsibility for did not end with the 5th of December attack on Bangui, nor with the Yamwara school incident that you have just heard about from my colleague. Now, following Jotodia's resignation, Yekatom and his anti-Balaka group progressed from their Yamwara school base further southwest into the Lobaye prefecture. They moved along the strategic PK9 Mbaiki axis, which stretches across approximately 110 kilometers, and it links Bangui with the Lobaye prefecture's capital of Mbaiki. Now, evidence shows that in their progression, Yekatom and his group took over towns and villages on that axis. As you can see, these included Sekia, Ndangala, Bimon, Kapu, and Pisa. Yekatom and his elements, dressed in a mix of military and civilian clothing and armed with various weapons, including firearms and machetes, will appear in a footage filmed in Sekia, which you will see on your screens now.
Yekegona tiso na doa Amenita molenge gibeti Ekesala tiso tongana ya Union européenne mabandu kema Nations Unies momuni maboko Timulo rokaye iape Carrément ikunda tikisiriri Ipapa simingi imulo romingi Kopa ke dapen dara ke fa Ingomba ke toto Beti ya ke pika
Evidence also shows that Yekatom's group freely entered each of these locations without any resistance, because the Seleka fled. In the words of insider P1647, when they, the Seleka, heard that we were coming, they fled. So did thousands of Muslim civilians, many of whom fled to the provincial capital of Mbaiki. Evidence shows that Muslim population left the towns and villages along the PK9 and Mbaiki axis because they feared being targeted and killed by Yekatom's anti-Balaka elements, and not because of their fear of intercommunal violence. This is explained by the mayor of Mbaiki, who stated, I quote, "As Yekatom progressed through Lobaye, all the Muslims fled towards Mbaiki. All were fleeing Yekatom's anti-Balaka." When speaking about the flight of these Muslim civilians, the mayor of Pisa testified, I quote, "The economic operators, traders, farmers, cattle breeders, everybody. In order to avoid a bloodbath, they all went to Mbaiki. They wanted to avoid what had happened in Bangui on the 5th of December," he added. Your Honors, the fears of these civilians were not unfounded. Far from bringing peace and security to the region, Yekatom and his elements continued targeting Muslims. As mentioned by my colleague, Mr. Garcia, insider witness P1839 confirmed that as the takeover of the PK9 and Mbaiki axis progressed, Yekatom and his deputy, Wanjo, specifically ordered members of the group to kill all Muslims. Thus, in the words of the same insider, Muslims fled for their security. If the anti-Balaka found them, they would have been killed. Anybody who was Muslim would be killed, said the witness. In their advance, Yekatom and his group established checkpoints all along the PK9 and Mbaiki axis. They were set up in PK9, in Sekia, Bimon, Kapu, and Pisa, and later also in Mbaiki. Your Honors can see a short footage of Yekatom's elements in Pisa checkpoint on your screens. Now, evidence shows that at these checkpoints, Yekatom's elements regulated movement, they collected illegal taxes, and once again, they sought out and targeted Muslims. Insider witness P954 testified that at these roadblocks, Yekatom's elements checked whether the passing vehicles belonged to Muslims, and the witness added, I quote, "To pass these checkpoints, God had to be with you really. Otherwise, you could be killed." Now, by the end of January 2014, aside from its own Muslim population, Mbaiki was also sheltering thousands of Muslims who had fled from the surrounding areas and were seeking shelter in the provincial capital. Both local and displaced Muslims experienced extremely difficult living conditions, facing shortages of food, of basic shelter, and other items of basic necessity. P2389 explained, I quote, "As the number of Muslims in Mbaiki started to increase, it became more difficult to get food. Bishop Reno handed out bags of rice to Muslim families. The bishop confirmed that with the assistance of Caritas, the displaced were provided with some food. He added, I quote, "You have to imagine these were people, mothers who have babies, etc. They had to leave everything. They had to leave their houses. So what could they bring with them? Perhaps they could bring something, but then what afterwards?" As Yekatom and his group approached Mbaiki, the local authorities' concerns for the fate and the security of the town, and especially of its Muslim civilians, mounted. Defense witness D29-5015 conceded that he did not want Yekatom to enter Mbaiki, explaining, I quote, "I live in Mbaiki, you know. I didn't want war to come to Mbaiki." Thus, on the 30th of January 2014, a security meeting was organized by local church and administrative authorities at the Saint-Jean d'Arc Church. The meeting was initially aimed to bring both the Seleka and the Antsibalaka together. However, the Seleka fled the night before the meeting, and Yekatom was the representative of the only remaining armed group in the area. Under the watchful eyes of other attendees, including Sangari forces, representatives of the UNHCR and of the Danish Refugee Council, Yekatom gave assurances that Muslim civilians would not be harmed. But, Your Honors, evidence shows that these were empty words, and importantly, his elements knew that. This is very clearly demonstrated by evidence that shortly after the meeting, one of Yekatom's elements made threatening gestures to Muslims in Mbaiki and said, "We'll finish with you." Although this happened in Yekatom's presence, he did nothing. He did not even reprimand his elements for the threats. Your Honors, Yekatom's elements continued to threaten Muslim civilians in Mbaiki in the following days. They repeatedly told them to leave, and they gestured, running their fingers across their throats. After the Antsibalaka arrived, they started to threaten us, saying that they were going to kill us, testified one resident of Mbaiki, P1666. They, the Antsibalaka and Mbaiki, were very aggressive and were threatening the Muslims. I saw them pointing to Muslims and showing gestures of drawing their finger across the throat, suggesting that they're going to cut our throats. I feared for my life and the lives of my family when I saw this, said another Mbaiki resident, P2389. Now, when asked to describe the Antsibalaka threats against Mbaiki Muslim civilians, P2353 also testified. He said they were death threats, invariably death threats. Similarly, P2354 said, I quote, "The Antsibalaka that had accompanied Rambo threatened us, but they were afraid to harm us while the Sangari were there. The Antsibalaka had said such things as, 'We will kill you Muslims, we will cut your throats, and we will eat you.'" Your Honors, these are the words not only of direct eyewitnesses, but of individuals who are also victims, of civilians who were forced to flee their homes, often with nothing more than the clothes they had on their backs, afraid that if they stayed, they would be killed along with their families. Their testimony refutes defense position that Muslim civilians were merely fleeing intercommunal violence when they fled Mbaiki. P1595 explicitly rejected this suggestion during his testimony with basic common sense. When asked, whom were the Muslims afraid of? He unequivocally replied, they were afraid of the Antsibalaka who were there. The ones that they had been living alongside, they weren't afraid of them. They were afraid of the Antsibalaka who had come in and might assault them at any time. They were not afraid of the local people. In fact, Your Honors, Yekatom's own elements acknowledge that Muslims fled because of their presence. One element, P1647, testified, I quote, "We were in Mbaiki. We were there for 1 to 2 weeks, and it was our presence that scared them and made them leave." Thus, the evidence shows that from 6 February 2014, almost the entirety of Mbaiki's Muslim population fled. Thousands of Muslim civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, fled to Chad or to other parts of CAR. They did so with the assistance of convoys sent by Chadian forces and the MISCA. Some of these civilians left using their own vehicles and relying on the protection provided by these forces, especially when passing through checkpoints that were manned by Yekatom's elements en route to Bangui. P2354 described the evacuation, stating, "We basically went into exile. We had left all our belongings, all our houses and land, and climbed into Chadian trucks or joined the convoy because there was no security for us. We were not armed, and we would be killed by the Anti-Balaka if we had stayed, just as what happened to those who did not flee, such as Jido." His words echo many others who were also forced to embark onto Chadian trucks and leave the little that they had behind. Within 2 weeks, almost the entirety of Mbaiki's Muslim population had been displaced. The second deputy mayor, Jido Saleh, and his family were among the only Muslims that were left. Your Honors, despite the threats from the Anti-Balaka and the warnings from his friends pleading him to leave, Jido Saleh refused. He didn't join the mass exodus of other Muslims. He said, "I was born here. My children were born here. I've worked in the mayor's office for 5 years. I'm a patriot. Why should I leave?" The footage of Jido Saleh you're about to see shows the dire situation in which he found himself.
On est dans le risque total. Dans le risque total. Bon, comme nous sommes des responsables, exemple, moi, je suis le deuxième adjoint au maire, ici, une fondation, ici, ça nous fait peur, ça nous fait peur. Ça nous fait peur parce que, mais, on est dans le risque total. Dans le risque total. Bon, comme nous sommes des responsables, exemple, moi, je suis le deuxième adjoint au maire, ici, une fondation, ici, fondation de ce pays. J'aille où? Aller où? Je ne peux pas ici dans mon pays. Je suis musulman. Je suis musulman.
A few days later, on the 28th of February 2014, a number of individuals, including at least 3 of Yekatom's elements, attacked Saleh's house. While Saleh attempted to defend his home, armed with nothing but a bow and arrow, his pregnant wife and his children managed to flee. However, when Saleh tried to flee to save his own life, he was pursued by the attackers. He was caught just meters away from the local gendarmerie. He was killed in broad daylight, and his body was then mutilated. Saleh's wife was unable to attend his burial because, in the words of P. 1838, if the Anti-Balaka took note of her presence, she could have been executed. Now, during trial, Your Honors have seen a video showing Saleh's body being dragged through the streets and savagely mutilated. I will not replay this footage again today, but the screenshot you will see shows a woman dismembering his body. Your Honors, the defense contradicts the defense position that Jido Saleh was murdered solely by members of the local population. In fact, it shows that Yekatom's elements were among the perpetrators of his killing. You will recall that two of Yekatom's subordinates identified the woman who took part in Saleh's murder and mutilation as a member of Yekatom's group named Honorine Bafolo or Mama Tia Godobe. That a female member of the Antibalaka mutilated Saleh's body is corroborated by multiple sources of evidence, both testimonial and documentary. And this is cited in the prosecution's closing brief. Now, her involvement in the murder was reported to and discussed with the Antibalaka Com Zone in Mbaiki, Staforsete. An insider identified two more elements from Yekatom's group among the co-perpetrators of this murder. There was a soldier named Cyril Ngombe and another element whose name the witness could not remember. Multiple other witnesses, as well as documentary evidence, also confirmed that the Antibalaka were among the perpetrators. In any event, even if local civilians participated as well, this does not undermine Yekatom Ngaissona's criminal responsibility for this incident, since at least 3 of Yekatom's elements were among the perpetrators. Now, both Cyril Ngombe and Honorine Bafolo were well known to Yekatom. They appeared on multiple lists of his elements. You will recall that Honorine Bafolo was also identified in a video footage which was filmed in Sekia, and it was shown earlier today. Now, in spite of their criminal conduct, both remained in Yekatom's group well into the DDR process. Witness P1838 testified that following Saleh's murder, Miska ordered Yekatom and his elements to leave Mbaiki because, I quote, they did not want what happened to Jido to happen to others. Your Honors, the Antibalaka under Yekatom committed these crimes and acts that I described in a coordinated effort to cleanse the towns and villages along PK9 and Mbaiki of their Muslim population. Their attack on Muslim civilians, their expulsion, the murder of a prominent Muslim leader in Mbaiki, and the commission of violent crimes and acts all severely deprived the Muslim inhabitants of these towns and villages of their fundamental rights based on political, ethnic, and/or religious grounds, which amounts to persecution charged as count 28. Your Honors, I will now turn to count 29 for the enlistment and use of children in hostilities. Your Honors, multiple insiders, including P2232, P1962, P0884, all confirmed that children were among anti-Balaka elements, generally. All 3 of these insiders also confirmed that at least some of these children were below the age of 15, and according to P884, some were as young as around age 10. In fact, evidence shows that wherever there were armed groups at the time, there were children who joined them. The Antibalaka, and more specifically Yekatom's Antibalaka group, were not an exception. Children were used by the Antibalaka for a variety of tasks: manning checkpoints, spying on the enemy, carrying out various household activities, carrying equipment, participating in combat. One witness explained that he saw children used by Anti-Balaka to carry supplies and to provide water to their elders in Boeing during the 5 December attack on Bangui. Consistent with this general anti-Balaka policy, Yekatom and his group also enlisted children into their group, including those under 15, from at least December 2013 through August 2014. Some joined because they were seeking revenge. Others were seeking protection. They were used for a variety of tasks. One insider testified how a child from Yekatom's group slit the throat of a captured Muslim after being ordered to do so by Yekatom's deputy. This was corroborated by another insider who spoke about the same child when saying, I quote, "People told me that he had already killed someone, that he'd already cut the head of a young man." The same witness estimated that this child was 11, 12 years old. This estimate is consistent, Your Honors, with images in which this child was identified at trial. Your Honors, defense will tell you that the boy in question was 17 years old during the relevant time. Now, their argument is based on a reissued birth certificate, which was obtained in 2022, that is unreliable and therefore lacks any probative value. This birth certificate indicates a date of birth which is not supported by any contemporaneous records. In this regard, the prosecution also reminds the Chamber of the evidence demonstrating that official records, including birth certificates in general, are easily and routinely falsified in the CAR. Another child, P2476, testified that he too was under the age of 15 when he joined Yekatom's group. The witness explained that two more children within the group were even younger than him. And the age estimate of at least one of these two children is independently corroborated by P1974. When describing their tasks, P2476 said, I quote, "When the adults would leave to patrol, we children would stay back to guard the base and ensure its security." He and the others were also sent to buy provisions and cook for the elements. Contrary to the defense's position, P2476 provided a coherent, internally consistent and detailed testimony, which is both credible and reliable. His account is corroborated not only by other witnesses, including P1974 and P2018, but importantly, by contemporaneous documentary evidence, as mentioned in our closing brief. Your Honors, 5 different witnesses confirmed that they also saw children below the age of 15 assisting at anti-Balaka roadblocks or otherwise maintaining security in various towns and villages in Lobaye during the relevant time when Yekatom's elements, his group, controlled the area. P1813, P1974, and P2018 detailed the circumstances in which they saw children who were below the age of 15 at the Sekia and Pisa roadblocks manned by Yekatom's elements. P1813 testified, I quote, "I often traveled between Bangui and Mbaiki, and I would see very young boys from 10 years old at the Sekia and Pisa anti-Balaka barriers. I saw the children among the anti-Balaka elements who were working at the barriers. The children wore a mix of military uniforms and civilian clothes. Some of them wore gris-gris around their necks and arms. I saw the children, even the younger ones, carrying traditional weapons, like knives, bows, and arrows. He then adds, these children were part of the Anti-Balaka, not children that would just come and play around the Anti-Balaka bases. P1974 independently estimates that the youngest child he saw at the Pisa roadblock was 9-10 years old. Even defense witness D29-5015 estimated that the children he saw carrying out the manual work of lifting up the wood at a roadblock on the Mbaiki-Boda axis were 10 years, 12 years old. Your Honors, evidence also shows that children under the age of 15 were present among Yekatom's elements at his Yamwara school base. One witness describes seeing armed children at this base, including a young boy of about 12, who he says was still very small. According to this witness, the children had machetes in their hands and were wearing gris-gris. These were not, as the defense suggests, simply local children who happened to be wandering around the base. This last witness's testimony on this point is consistent also with photographic and video evidence depicting young boys among Yekatom's elements at the Yamwara school base. And you will see some of these on your screens, Your Honors. While some of the children could arguably be 15 or just over, others appear particularly small and young. Now, the first clip I will show you shows footage filmed inside a classroom where a young boy appears wearing a beige t-shirt, and he's visibly smaller than the other elements surrounding him. Your Honors will also see his comparative size in the next screenshot of the same video. Now, the same boy appears in the next clip, this time filmed in Sekia, where he followed Yekatom's group together with the other elements. Now, another young boy, who claims that he's 15, appears in a footage filmed back at the Yamwara school.
One young man, who called himself B13, told us he was 15, but looked
Now, Your Honors are going to see yet another boy in a screenshot of a video filmed during a training session in the Yamwara school. It comes from a video that was shown by my colleague, Ms. Prathaban. And finally, this photo, which is also taken at the Yamwara school, shows a young boy wearing gris-gris. Your Honors, the children in Yekatom's group experienced difficult living conditions. They lacked basic necessities like food and water, and were subject to punishments. For instance, P2476 described being terrified when witnessing another child getting beaten as a form of punishment. Yekatom was aware of the presence of children in his anti-Balaka group. He knew some of them by name, as described by P1974, and you will find the details in our closing brief. Evidence shows that he also routinely saw them at his bases. For example, P2476 describes how during one such visit, Yekatom shouted at the children in the group and told them that in the anti-Balaka they were not to behave like children, yet he never told P2476 to leave. Your Honors, evidence regarding the demobilization of child soldiers facilitated by the NGO Enfants Sans Frontières, ESF, in 2014 further corroborates that children under 15 were present in Yekatom's group during the charged period, and that Yekatom was aware of this. I'd like to play an excerpt of a video that was filmed during the demobilization ceremony on the 4th of August 2014. This video shows Yekatom signing the demobilization agreement, where he agrees to demobilize 153 children from his group and refrain from re-recruiting them. And this is the document that he signed, that you can see on your screens, signed on behalf of the anti-Balaka by Yekatom. Now, the defense alleges that ESF, I quote, concocted a demobilization program involving false child soldiers. And following a new strategy, they add a novel element in their closing brief, stating that Yekatom was in fact aware of the fraudulent nature of the demobilization program, but his agreement to cooperate with it was not fully informed. However, although the demobilization project was not without issues, there is reliable evidence that some of its participants were members of Yekatom's group and were below the age of 15. As such, the defense's blanket position that the demobilization program was entirely fraudulent ignores several important factors. First, it was UNICEF, not ESF, that alerted the NGO to the presence of young children among Yekatom's elements in the Lobaye prefecture. It was also UNICEF that initiated the demobilization program. It was UNICEF that reached out to the ESF to assist with the implementation of the program on the ground. Second, evidence shows that the project was organized and implemented in very close collaboration with Yekatom and with his comzones. They were the ones who initially identified children within their ranks and provided various details, including their age. They provided these details to the ESF. And this process was done, Your Honors, with Mr. Yekatom's knowledge and with his approval. Yekatom also personally met with several organizers of the demobilization program. And this happened in the lead up to the release of the children from his group. Evidence also shows that Yekatom admitted that he would be relieved if the children were to leave his group. He would be relieved if they were taken from him, as he did not have the means to take care of them anymore. Now, throughout their many interactions with the organizers of the demobilization project, neither Yekatom nor his subordinates ever denied the presence of children in the group. On the contrary, when the presence of children, including those 13, 14 years old at checkpoints, was discussed personally with Yekatom, he confirmed that indeed there were children within the group, and that those children played different roles. Third, the fact that at least some of the children in the program were members of Yekatom's group and below the age of 15 is corroborated by other evidence. For instance, P2082 testified that some of the demobilized children expressed their desire to return to the anti-Balaka camps, suggesting that they were not merely pretending to have been part of the group. The witness estimated that these specific children were about 13, 14 years old. P2082 further testified that another demobilized child, who said that he joined the anti-Balaka in Bangui, was 11 years old. The witness specified, I quote, that he really had the voice of a child. I would now like to show a couple of photographs of the children who took part in the demobilization. And your honors will recall that some of these children were identified at trial by various witnesses. They are visibly young. Your honors, the defense also repeatedly brought forward allegations of fabrication of evidence in relation to count 29. Now, these allegations largely concerned the conduct of individuals who are not prosecution witnesses. They are not prosecution witnesses in this case, and they provided no evidence to this court. P2580, P2582, P2620, P2638, P2583, P2511. None of them are prosecution witnesses. And the prosecution does not rely on any documents that were obtained from these individuals. Further, collusion allegations concerning 2 ESF witnesses concern matters that fall outside the time frame of the case. They have no bearing on the ESF demobilization program of 2014. Last, as previously mentioned by my colleague, Mr. Belbenoit Avik, the prosecution does not rely on P2475's evidence. Your honors, to conclude, the evidence that the prosecution does rely on to substantiate count 29 is credible, it's reliable, and it demonstrates, beyond any reasonable doubt, that children under 15 were recruited and used by Yekatom and his group during the relevant time. I thank you, and I will hand the floor to my colleague, Mr. van der Poye.
Thank you, Ms. Berdenikova. Mr. van der Poye. Take your time, Mr. van der Poye. And it's important that we can hear you, obviously.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning to you again. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, everyone. As I foreshadowed a bit earlier, I have a few observations, remarks I'd like to make before we complete our presentation. As you know, for the most part, the events in 2014 concerning the anti-Balaka crimes in the provinces are not charged against these accused. Mr. Yekatom obviously did, as the evidence shows, commit crimes and order crimes in that period. Nevertheless, the crimes of the anti-Balaka which occurred during 2014 form part of the context of the anti-Balaka crimes as confirmed by the pretrial chamber. They form part of the widespread attack that was part and parcel of the Article 7 attack that was confirmed. Significantly, the accused conduct extends into this period. Both Mr. Ngaissona and Mr. Yekatom contributed to the crimes that were committed by the anti-Balaka as a whole in this broader context. In the case of Mr. Yekatom, you have clear evidence of his direct participation in crimes along the PK9 and Baiki axis in Boeing, Bangui, Yekatom. The crimes committed along the PK9 and Baiki axis occurred through January and February of 2014, including the killing, the murder of Jito Saleh, and the forcible transfer and unlawful displacement of virtually the entire Muslim population along that axis. And it is a long stretch. It's anywhere from 80 to 100 kilometers. His and his group's direct involvement in the perpetration of the crimes that are charged is crystal clear. For Mr. Ngaissona, the case of his contributions primarily derived from his conduct in connection with the anti-Balaka's targeting of the Muslim civilian population and having instrumentalized them to unseat Jotodia and the Seleka in relation in particular to the 5 December attacks on Bangui and Bosongoa. As the pretrial chamber observed, and the evidence is proven before this chamber, those attacks were part of a larger plan and strategy which Ngaissona participated in to reclaim power in CAR together with members of Bozizé's inner circle. They were essential components of that strategy. We believe the evidence in this case before you proves exactly that. However, as previously mentioned, those attacks and their aftermaths were lasting. They involved continuing crimes. Ngaissona's conduct in 2014 contributed to those ongoing charged crimes directly. The context in which they persisted, and they committed, and as well as contributed to the crimes committed by Yekatom and his group, a calm zone under the national coordination and his elements. The Ngaissona defense has portrayed Mr. Ngaissona as a person seeking peace in the Central African Republic. They've argued that on several occasions during the course of the trial, and I'm sure that they will argue that during their closing remarks. In my presentation, I showed you a request that he received and acted on for weapons, supplies, and money to purchase the same in relation to combat on the ground by the anti-Balaka. Ms. Straven also showed you a second email he received in this respect. This was back in October 2013. Only a few days before and seeking peace receive a communication like that, respond like that, not report it, be trusted enough not to report it. When you look at an email like that, it is obvious that he had already been assisting and contributing to the Anti-Balaka, including facilitating its efforts to expand its military capacity and operations. Certainly his return to Bangui to lead the Anti-Balaka was not incidental. It was obviously and clearly predetermined on the evidence that you have before you. In fact, there are contemporaneous communications among individuals close to Bozizé and his inner circle, which confirm this. Aimé Vincent Bozizé, the son and brother of Franklin, on 11 January 2014, in an exchange, says Ngaissona will arrive in Bangui to organize the return of the boss. That's at Cairo TP 2132-9197 at 9202 through 9203. Same thing on 12 January 2014 in a conversation involving Buragoro, Jean-Alexis, I think is his first name. He says Ngaissona will return to Bangui on the instructions of the boss, sur l'instruction du boss. Cairo TP 2102-4497 at 4615 through 4618. And Ngaissona did not just parachute in one day to lead the Anti-Balaka, the 70,000 fighters in the provinces and another 10,000 in Bangui that he claims the group comprised, or the 52,000 that Bejuan says comprise the group, or the 40,000 that P446 says comprise the group. That's a lot of people. He was already a recognized leader within the group, just like P2843, P2841, and P0884 testified to under oath in this court. His contributions to the Anti-Balaka arose long before his return and continued thereafter in his capacity as the National General Coordinator. P884 cleared up the mystery as to what is the National General Coordinator's job. In that role, he clarified, Mr. Ngaissona was the person who was in charge of managing the Anti-Balaka, all the Anti-Balaka. The National General Coordinator is the person that is in charge of the Anti-Balaka in Bangui and in the provinces. The National General Coordinator is the person who was the leader of the movement and in the highest position in that hierarchy. The National General Coordinator was above the operations coordinator. He had the authority and the right to discharge the operations coordinator. That is, to kick him out or replace him. He had the authority to replace and assign or dismiss comm zones. You'll find that at transcript 56, page 59, lines 4 through 25. It's all there, and there's more. In discharging or failing to discharge any of these functions, Mr. Ngaissona could and did contribute to the Anti-Balaka's continuing crimes, directly or indirectly. Moreover, the evidence is clear that he exercised his authority, continuing to mobilize, structure, and finance the group. There can be no doubt that he was fully aware that the Anti-Balaka had committed crimes, were committing crimes, and intended to commit crimes of the nature of those with which he is charged in this case. And as I said, he could have walked away at any time. He, of all, had the means to do so. Instead, he chose to remain. He chose to remain in that leadership position, and he chose to exercise the authority that came with it. He didn't remain to bring peace. He remained to finish what he started, and that was to get power in his country, whether on the coattails of Bozizé or in his own right. He did that regardless of the human cost, which was obvious and plain for the world to see. His claim that he was converting the anti-Balaka into a political party was an illusion. You have the testimony of P992, who prepared the PCUD documents and submitted them. He confirmed that it was basically just a different name for the same group of people. And here you can see a draft of the Bureau. You can see the names of the anti-Balaka coordination basically just lined out with different titles put on it. And Ngaissona had the authority which he exercised, and it was plenary. He said so himself in a March 2014 interview, saying, and I quote in French, "Les anti-Balaka n'ont pas deux entités. Les anti-Balaka que je coordonne, c'est unique. C'est réparti sur toute l'étendue du territoire. Quand je donne l'ordre à ces enfants, je pense immédiatement ça suffit." That's at car OTP 20140-749. That's the audio. And the timing of it is it's 1 minute 11 seconds through 1 minute 35 seconds. You have it. In 2014, in March, when he gave that interview, Muslims were in enclaves under siege by the anti-Balaka elements under the umbrella of the National Coordination, which he led throughout the Central African Republic. The Bosangoa enclave is but one example, and he's charged with that. But there were enclaves in Boda, in Karno, and in several other places. Even Muslims in PK5 were under siege by the anti-Balaka at the time that he gave that interview. While the defense cast Ngaissona's provision of money as an act of generosity, one insider explained its true motivation. And I quote, this is P954. As the general coordinator, Ngaissona coordinated the actions of the movement. No surprise there. If something went wrong in the country, he would call the comm zones and would, for example, order them to erect roadblocks. When he said something, everybody had to execute it. I received plenty of orders from him to erect roadblocks or create disorder. P808 indicated that no significant operation could be carried out without Ngaissona's knowledge and approval. P808 was Ngaissona's political advisor in the National Coordination. He's somebody who Mr. Ngaissona was in contact with going back to June 2013. And he stayed with him throughout 2014 until he was threatened by the anti-Balaka himself. Whether it was structuring the group, financing it, liaising with key figures, or giving directions, instructions, or orders as the National General Coordinator, Ngaissona acted to promote the practical and ideological objectives of the group. Had he not, he clearly would not have remained as the group's leader. That's just basic common sense. Your Honors, the charged crimes are undeniable, and the accused contributions to them are also undeniable. We've gone through these proceedings almost with a presumption that the anti-Balaka was a lawfully constituted group operating within the bounds of domestic or international law, It was not. Yekatom's group was not a lawful group. By what authority, by what law do these men have the right to target civilians who disagree, who they think disagree with them? Nobody voted Mr. Yekatom to run a group targeting civilians. Nobody voted for Mr. Ngaissona to be able to do that. They don't represent the Central African Republic. They never have. They took it upon themselves to do that. And many innocent civilians paid the price for their own actions. Mr. Yekatom is responsible, as the evidence proves, for ordering and committing 21 counts of crimes against humanity and war crimes together with his anti-Balaka group. 21 counts. Mr. Ngaissona's responsibility for aiding and abetting and or otherwise contributing in any other way to the anti-Balaka's commission of crimes, the charged crimes in this case, including those by Yekatom group, amount to 31 counts and is proved by the evidence in this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Do justice. The victims are many. They deserve nothing less. Hold the accused to account on the evidence you have before you. Mr. President, that concludes our presentation. I thank you once again for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. van der Poeje. We have now the break until 11:30, and then we continue with the presentations by the CLREs.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.